All right, today we're jumping into a really interesting discussion that happened over on Fox Business. It was all centered on a bombshell report about an alleged secret plan by the US to bring down Cuba's communist government. So, let's get right into what they had to say.
So this is the line that kicked everything off. This single sentence from a Wall Street Journal report the host spout up set the entire stage. The claim is that the administration has this really aggressive goal to totally change the game just 90 miles from Florida, and to do it fast. This was the explosive idea the panel spent the whole time picking apart.
So, to really get a handle on their conversation, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at the details of the supposed plan itself. Then, the reasons they gave for why now is the time to act. Third, we'll get into how this could kick off a global domino effect. After that, the battle between a president's legacy and political risk. And we'll wrap it all up with the big one. What's in it for the American voter?
Okay, so first things first, what does this plan actually look like? The panel didn't just talk in broad strokes, they really tried to get into the nuts and bolts of what the journal was reporting.
According to the report they were discussing, this isn't about some big military invasion. No, the strategy is more of a political chess move. The whole idea is to find people on the inside of the Cuban government. You know, people who might be willing to help change things from within. And the timing here is everything. The thinking is you have to strike when the regime seems like it's at its weakest point.
And that, of course, brings us to the next big question the panel got into. Why now? I mean, after decades of things being the way they are, what makes this moment so special? Well, their discussion pointed to a kind of perfect storm of factors. The picture the panelists were painting was of a Cuba just falling apart. They're talking severe food and fuel shortages, rolling blackouts, and an economy that's right on the edge of total collapse. On top of all that, its main supporter, Venezuela, is also in a really weak position. So, from their point of view, this isn't just a crisis, right? It's a strategic opening. The idea is that all these internal problems make the regime more vulnerable to outside pressure than ever before.
Now, this is where the conversation got really interesting, because it shifted from just pure strategy to something much more personal, much more emotional. One of the commentators, Gary Kaltbaum, started sharing stories about his Cuban friends, and you could just hear this deep frustration that after all these decades, nothing has changed for them. For him, it wasn't just politics. It was a moral thing, a long overdue move for the people of Cuba.
And that led the host to ask this really fundamental question. I mean, if this regime has been able to hang on for so long, what could possibly knock it over? The unspoken answer floating around the conversation was that little tweaks won't work. The fact that they've survived this long suggests that only something really big, a real big move, has any chance of working.
From there, the whole conversation just zoomed way out. This wasn't just about the Caribbean anymore. The panelists started connecting the dots to a much bigger global chessboard.
One of the commentators, Jackie DeAngelis, she really laid this theory out super clearly. She basically said that after dealing with Venezuela, Cuba and Iran were the next 2 things on the agenda. She was drawing this direct line from the communist government in Cuba to what she called the religious oppression in Iran, hinting at this pattern of taking on unfriendly governments one after the other.
But, wouldn't a move like that make things more unstable everywhere else? The host brought up a huge question. Could taking action in Cuba create chaos that might encourage China to finally make a move on Taiwan? It's a serious thought, but another panelist immediately shot it down. They argued the exact opposite, that a big show of American strength would actually scare China off, not encourage them.
And this really gets us to the heart of the whole debate, the real tension here. Because look, it's one thing to talk about changing the world map, but it's a completely different thing to have to face voters in an election soon. And that's exactly the conflict the panel started wrestling with. This was the big dilemma on the table. Let's say you believe that freeing Cuba is absolutely the right thing to do. Is it worth it if it costs you politically right before a big election? Could putting all this focus on foreign policy totally backfire when people at home are worried about their wallets? The case for taking that risk, it was all about the long game. It was all about history. Jackie DeAngelis made the point that if this worked, it would be a legacy-defining moment, something people would read about in history books for centuries. From that perspective, a little short-term political pain is nothing compared to a huge historical win. Dagan McDowell really broke down the political math here. You've got this push and pull. On the one hand, she said, this is something a big part of the Republican base has been wanting for,
well, for generations. But on the other hand, she was worried that it could make the administration look out of touch with voters who are just trying to afford gas and groceries, and that could lead to a disaster in the midterms. But in the end, her thinking came back to that legacy argument that history remembers big achievements, not necessarily how you got there.
And all of this, the geopolitics, the history, the morality, it all boils down to one final, very practical, and let's be honest, very American question. And it's interesting. The panel did touch on another way this could go. Did it have to be a direct, big thing? One panelist wondered if maybe the economic pressure already in place, like cutting off Venezuelan oil, could be enough to basically starve the regime and let the Cuban people rise up and handle it themselves without more direct American involvement. But whether we're talking about direct action or just tightening the screws economically, the panel pretty much landed on the idea that the success of the whole thing all depends on one thing: how it plays back home. It's all about how the average voter sees it.
And there it is. That's the final takeaway from their entire discussion. According to panelist Dagan McDowell, when you get right down to it, every voter, when faced with a huge foreign policy move like this, is going to ask one simple thing. And that's the bottom line the panel left us with, that no matter how big the global stakes are, the success of any grand plan, in their view, comes down to whether it can answer that one very personal question.